This is Professor Doherty, and today I will start into talking about the immune system. So this is the first lecture of 3 on the immune system, so Immunology 1, and today I will be going through an overview of the immune system. So it should be relatively straightforward and simple, I think, and then just real briefly a little bit of extra information on the innate immune system, which is one of the major categories of immunology, so to speak. Okay, so to start off with, what is immunity? So you should understand this basic, so go ahead and write this down if you're not already. Immunity is the body's ability to protect itself from bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens. And also protect itself against defective cells of its own. So just so you're aware, we can have defective cells in our own system, and typically that will be called cancer, but those cells are called self cells, so S-E-L-F, so self cells. So basically they're your own cells, but primarily the immune system is going after bacteria and viruses, so that's why I separate those out independently, but it will go after any other pathogen as well. So with that, let's just talk real quickly. So this is basically my overview here. I'm going to come off this though and go to whiteboard. So let's talk about what the immune system consists of. So the immune system has several parts. So this is what it consists of here essentially. Is the first part consists of what we call lymphoid tissue. And lymphoid tissue, the concept of this is relatively simple. As you may have denoted from the name, this is tissue that contains lymphocytes. So, and many of you are probably aware, because you probably had anatomy, but if you haven't, that's fine. Lymphocytes reside in a number of different areas. Primarily when we talk about this, we're talking about, the lymphatic system. Which is a series of vessels. I talked about this briefly before, probably, I think, with the blood system. Basically, the lymphatic system sucks up the extracellular fluid that's left behind from blood as it passes through capillaries, right? There's that 10% that's left over, that extra fluid has to get sucked up by something. That is the lymphatic system that takes care of that. Within the lymphatic system, many of you are aware of lymph nodes, right? Those contain a lot of lymphocytes. As well as within the lymphatic system, there are lymph vessels that do the transporting of the fluid. So, basically, lymphoid tissue consists of the lymphatic system, and the lymphatic system, like I said, is sucking up this extra fluid from all areas of the body and transporting it back, and then it's going to dump that fluid eventually, just so you're aware, back into the blood. So it becomes essentially extracellular fluid that's getting sucked up by the lymphatic system is then going to get turned back into blood plasma and get dumped back into the blood system. Now the lymph nodes themselves have a lot of lymphocytes, and basically what they're there to do is to look at the extracellular fluid, which is now called lymphatic fluid, that's been sucked up by the lymphatic system, and they're looking for any defective cells in there or any bacteria or viruses. So they're really there kind of monitoring this flow of fluid as it goes through. Unfortunately, sometimes they can get clogged up with cancerous cells if they're close to a cancer site, and they might not always recognize the cancer. So that's one reason why lymph nodes sometimes have to be taken out when someone has cancer. Second part of the immune system is the part that most people understand or know about, and those are immune cells. immune cells consist of all the cells that you would normally think of. So white blood cells, there are several different types of white blood cells and subcategories of many of those as well. And along with white blood cells, there are also another type of cell called dendritic cells. Oops. And they're basically very similar. Dendritic cells have a tendency to sit permanently in the skin and in a few other places within the body and look for anything that's trying to invade the body. White blood cells can do this too, but they also have a tendency to go into the blood system and use the blood system as like a passageway to get to other parts of the body. So white blood cells can be both, a lot of these can be both, are either mobile or fixed. So some of these white blood cells will have a tendency to maybe stay in one tissue, and we would call those white blood cells, fixed white blood cells. And then some of them have a tendency to be mobile, and so they'll get into the bloodstream and travel around and look for trouble, basically. Oftentimes these are the same types of cells, so just because one is fixed does not mean that sisters of that cell can't be mobile. All right, and then the third and final major part of the immune system are chemicals. So the immune system uses chemicals in several different ways, and a couple I'll talk about here. The first way that chemicals are used are for signaling. Okay, and so you can write this down if you want. I'm just going to write down signaling, but basically signaling is the ability to call in other white blood cells. So for instance, if you have a little person here, right? So here's your little person. They get, they have a long neck, it looks like. They get a little bit of damage to their arm right here where this red part is. This little damage part will cause a release of chemical signals that go out to other parts of the body, and that will draw in other white blood cells from other parts of the bodies to go to that damaged site. Okay, so that's what those chemical signals are being used for primarily. Okay, and with this signaling, you can also get response coordination, so coordination of a response. So you may get timing of different types of white blood cells coming in, different ones being called for different problems. There's a whole bunch of different chemical signals that are actually used, and some examples of this, or of signaling chemicals, just so you know, there's a ton of these. And these are some of the overarching categories. So lysozymes, perforin is one, cytokines, opsonins, and the last one that I have is chemotaxins, but I'm sure there are plenty more. Oops, guess I didn't need to do that last part there. Oh well, there you go. So as you can see here, some of these are categories, most of these are categories of chemicals. Some are individual chemicals, like perforin. I think there's only one type. But basically, there's a whole series of chemicals that can be released that can call in other white blood cells to the area. And in fact, these chemical signals don't necessarily have to come from your own cells or from your own white blood cells. Some of these chemicals are released by bacteria as they move through the system, or maybe cells that have been infected with a virus. So not all of these are just created by your own cells. Okay, a couple of key features. So let me go to green pen here. So a couple of key features of the immune system. There's really two main things here, and that is specificity and memory. And so, these are part of usually the adaptive portion of the immune system, but not entirely. Sometimes the innate immune system can also employ these. But basically what this means is that your immune system can go after very specific types of bacteria and viruses and very specific pathogens. So it will create, usually this is through antibodies, let's say that. That's not the only way that it's specific, but typically in order to attack a specific bacteria or virus, very specific antibodies have to be made for that virus or bacteria. And we'll get into that when we get into the adaptive immune system. This also, your immune system can also use what's called memory. And so what this means is that it can actually remember, oops. So it can remember bacteria and viruses. And this is very important because if your body didn't remember bacteria and viruses from the past, then it would have to go through the entire system of trying to defeat a bacteria or a virus every single time it saw it again. And so it's actually quite remarkable. Your immune system has a huge library, a huge memory of the past bacteria and viruses that it's run into before. And so if it runs into that same bacteria or virus, it can go back to its library and actually pull up its memory of that, and it helps it to, that library helps it to defeat that bacteria or virus much more quickly when it sees it a second or a third or a fourth time down the line. Okay, so let me clear this out. And let's talk about the major functions. So there are three major functions of the immune system. Those major functions include some of the ones that we've already kind of talked about here. So protection against pathogens. And so pathogens being disease-causing invaders. So if we were to, put some limits around what pathogens are, or define what pathogens are, we would call these bacteria, viruses, parasites, which I haven't talked about yet. So a parasite is typically, we'd also call this a worm, right? And the other two are much more rare, so protozoans, and finally fungi. So those are the major pathogens that your body protects you against. Of course, there's a whole variety of other ones as well. Second major function, so again, this is overview of the immune system, is that your body needs to remove dead and damaged cells. So, throughout the course of your, daily life, if not life overall, cells within your body are going to die, and when they do, something needs to clean them up and clean up the mess that's made. And basically, that is white blood cells that are going to come along, or your immune system cells are going to come along and remove those dead cells. They will also do the same thing for damaged cells, as well as infected cells. So viruses have a tendency to infect cells, so they'll try to clean those out also. And then the third thing is that the immune system needs to recognize and remove abnormal, I'm going to change to a different color here, self cells. Okay. And what this means is, like I mentioned before, is that your immune system needs to be able to recognize its own cells and recognize cells that are not its own. And so for instance, let's go ahead and define over here. So if we say we need to distinguish, actually I'll do it over here, what a self cell is. A self cell is one of your own cells. So one of your own body cells is what I'll say here. And so this can be anything. It could be a kidney cell, it could be a skin cell, liver cell, whatever. And it needs to be able to distinguish that from what are called non-self cells, which are cells that do not belong to the body. And of course, we primarily recognize these as bacteria. However, non-self cells can create a problem for instance, if you get a transplant, right? So if you get, let's say you need a new liver, you get a new liver from someone and they put it into your body. Well, all of those cells within the liver are not your own cells. And part of the problem with transplants is that your own immune system is going to recognize and try to remove the non-self cells, and it will actually start attacking and trying to kill the liver. So that can create a lot of difficulties for transplants. That's why people have to go on medications and why you have to try to match donors as best you can as far as the identifying factors on the outside of the cells. So okay. So with that, let's go ahead and actually talk real quick again up here about removing abnormal self cells. So abnormal self cells typically mean your own cells that are doing something they're not supposed to do. Typically this means they're growing in a way that they're not supposed to, and we typically call this cancer as the most common one. Okay. So cancer is when your normal self cells, your own cells, begin to grow out of sequence or out of phase. They're basically rapidly growing when they're not supposed to. And so a normal life cycle for cells is, for instance, like if I drew some cells over here, you have a cell, it reproduces, right? And then that cell reproduces itself eventually as it goes through its own life cycle, right? And eventually, this cell goes through a number of different reproductive cycles, and eventually, though, it kills itself through a process called apoptosis, right? With cancer cells, what happens is if you get a cancerous cell develop, it will replicate itself, but it won't kill itself, and it will replicate itself and won't kill itself, and this just goes on until you basically wind up with tons and tons of cancer cells because they're not doing the normal apoptosis that they're supposed to. And so this eventually becomes a mass inside of your body filled with these cells, and that's what we know as cancer. Now, if you get parts of this cancer breaking away, and so normally these cells, your cells have a tendency to stick to each other, right? If they lose that ability to stick to each other and they begin to float out, they can get into the bloodstream. And then if they get into the bloodstream or the lymphatic stream, they can get carried to new places and set up shop and then begin to replicate there also. Because remember, they don't kill themselves, they just keep going, and then you have a new mass someplace else. And so that's basically when your cancer has become malignant and it takes off and starts growing all over the place. Very bad once it gets to that stage, very difficult to control. So, okay. So let's take a look here, and I'm going to bring this back up real quick, even though I only have like one slide I want to show you before I go back to my drawing board. Okay, so with that, that's basically a very brief overview of the immune system. Here I'm going to talk about some autoimmune diseases before I get into the innate immune system. So let's talk about pathologies in autoimmune diseases. So, a pathology within the immune system, which is called an autoimmune disease. So we have a number of autoimmune diseases. Okay, so this is going to be our first pathology, so listed as that. All right, so let me go ahead and click this over here. So this is immune system pathologies. So let's just go ahead and title it that. The first category, so I'm going to put this over here because I'm going to list the other categories out over to the right over here, so you can give yourself some space. The first one, like I mentioned, of a pathology of the immune system is called autoimmune diseases. These autoimmune diseases are diseases where you have your own immune system that attacks its own cells. And I should say its own healthy cells. Okay, so an autoimmune disease is when the immune system attacks its own healthy cells. There are a whole bunch of these. I'll list some of the big ones. Many of you are familiar with a number of these. So the first one I want to talk about briefly is type 1 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, the immune system attacks its own beta cells. So you should write down the immune system attacks its own beta cells. I'm doing this in shorthand. So the beta cells are attacked, and these cells are found in the pancreas, and they're used to make insulin. Okay, so in this type of disease, type 1 diabetes, it is an autoimmune system because the person's own immune system is specifically attacking the beta cells within the pancreas that make insulin. And so this basically greatly reduces or stops the production of insulin. So because of this, the person becomes diabetic because insulin, of course, is the hormone that allows your body to be able to absorb sugars. All right. This is different than a type 2 diabetic. So a type 2 diabetic is not having an autoimmune response, in fact. So type 2, which is the one that you see mostly, is not an autoimmune disease and is not an autoimmune response. Instead, it's a response due to the conditions that have been created in the body. And we'll talk about that as well. And I know I have talked about it a little bit in the past. So, okay. And so, one other thing I want to add here is that this type of diabetic makes up only about 5% of all diabetics are type 1. 95% are type 2. So in other words, most diabetics are that way due to diet rather than due to being born that way. All right. Okay, second type of autoimmune disease is multiple sclerosis. Now, in multiple sclerosis, this is a disease where the immune system attacks, and so you should write out the full sentence here so that you understand this. I'm doing this in shorthand. Multiple sclerosis is where the immune system attacks the myelin sheaths within the central nervous system. And if you don't know CNS, then write out the full central nervous system so you know what it is when you go back and look at your notes. So again, multiple sclerosis is when your immune system attacks the myelin sheaths within the central nervous system. Oftentimes this can come on later in life as well, so that's why you see MS patients sometimes that are a little bit older too. Okay, next type of autoimmune disease is called rheumatoid arthritis. And with rheumatoid arthritis, you get what's called chronic joint inflammation. And so what's happening here, so let me get rid of some of this over here, is within the joints, if I were to draw, let's say, a knee joint here, right? This could be any random joint, I guess. So within a joint, you have basically connective tissue layers on the ends of these joints that allow the joints to be able to glide over each other, right? And so I'm doing that in blue here on this picture. With rheumatoid arthritis, what happens is immune system cells come in and they begin to see these cells that make up this this layering on the end of the joint as being the enemy. And so what they do is they begin to attach here and they begin to attack all of this, and it makes it very inflamed and painful. And so basically they're seeing the connective tissue at the end of the joints as a foreign substance or as foreign cells, and they begin to attack these cells. And this degrades the ability of these cells to do their jobs, the joints to be able to function, as well as it causes a ton of inflammation just from the attacks that are happening here as well. So, all right, now you might be asking yourself, well, why does this happen? And there's a variety of reasons why any of these happen, but typically it has to do with the antigens that are on the outside of the cell. So sometimes your immune system can accidentally mistake a protein that's on the outside of a certain type of cell as something that's foreign. And there are a whole number of reasons why this can happen. It just does sometimes. For now, we'll talk about it later. But okay, next autoimmune disease is lupus. This one is a difficult disease because this is kind of a generalized autoimmune response. And this will actually attack many tissues of the body are involved here. So this is a difficult disease because it just attacks a lot of different places. I would imagine that it's probably difficult to diagnose at first, I would guess, because there's just so many things that can go wrong with lupus. So, all right, next type of autoimmune disease is celiac disease. And celiac disease is interesting because it's an immune reaction. I'm shorthanding reaction there as RXN. It's an immune reaction to when you eat gluten. And gluten is a protein found in grains, or primarily found in grains. And some of the problems that come out of celiac disease are, well, let's talk about why this happens. So gluten, this particular protein, can sometimes have a shape that's similar to some of the antigens on the cells that line the intestines. Okay, so again, this protein can have a similar shape to the protein or to the antigens that line some of the cells in the intestines. Now what that does is, so if I go over here, and if you imagine that here is your digestive system, so this is your GI tract, right here. So food is going to be coming down through the tract like this, right? And these dark lines over here are, so the dark lines over here are the cells that are lining the lumen that the food is going to run through, right? So so what can happen is if you have gluten come down through here, the gluten can trigger white blood cells So imagine that these green dots are white blood cells. They attack the gluten. So imagine that you have this gluten protein coming through here. They see this as harmful. These white blood cells see this gluten and make proteins to it to attack it, but accidentally this protein on this gluten looks like proteins that are sitting on the cells that are made by these cells that line the digestive system here. And what that does is that triggers these white blood cells to then go after and begin to try to attack these cells that line the gut. And of course, that causes all sorts of inflammation in here. So this just becomes very inflamed, and it leads to all sorts of digestive problems. So let me get rid of this real quick. These problems can be quite severe. I mean, you can get things like chronic diarrhea, depending on what you've eaten, right? So loss of appetite, your nutrition goes down, right? Because you're not absorbing food the way that you're supposed to, so you have a decrease in nutrition. Oftentimes, the triggering of celiacs is genetic, and so only some people will get this. Sometimes it can be triggered through things such as damage from surgery. I mean, just kind of really odd things. So this can come on later due to you may have a surgery and it triggers it. So you didn't have any problems before, you have a surgery, and suddenly now you have celiac disease. Very bizarre, right? But that can trigger the genetics that are behind the celiac disease. Things like emotional distress can trigger this at some point. Pregnancy has been known to cause this. And even extraneous viral infections can cause this, can trigger, I should say, trigger celiac disease. And the way that they test for this is they can actually test for celiacs with a blood test. So pretty fascinating how some of these things can be triggered, but you can also see how this can lead to misinformation about gluten, right? You probably all heard, oh, you shouldn't eat gluten, and that's really not true. That's just basically someone has taken celiac disease and blown it out of proportion, essentially. There are people who, like I say, are genetically prone to this disease, and their immune system is prone to accidentally misidentifying the gluten protein and then going after their own body cells. But it's rare, right? So eating gluten is fine for most people, unless you happen to have this condition. So, all right, next type of autoimmune disease is called ankylosing spondylitis. And ankylosing spondylitis is another type of arthritis. So arthritis, remember, is inflammation in the joints. The joint lining is being attacked by your white blood cells. So this is a type of arthritis that affects the spine and large joints. So when I say large joints, think like hip joints, knee joints, right? So fascinating. I mean, look at the difference here. So we had rheumatoid arthritis up here, which was a type of arthritis that caused just general chronic joint inflammation. Rheumatoid arthritis, by the way, if I go back up here, oftentimes you can see this in the hands, right? So that's one of the main places that you see it. Ankylosing spondylitis is in the spine and the large joints. So in other words, you might ask, well, why is one of these hitting one type of joints harder than the other, or only hitting one specific type of joint? It's probably because the linings of those joints, the cells in them just have made a different type of antigen that they're presenting on their surface, and this is being misidentified as a foreign invader. So, so really, I mean, some of these autoimmune diseases are really quite fascinating, I think. So, all right. And then the final type of autoimmune disease that I want you to be aware of is Crohn's disease. And Crohn's disease is similar in some ways to celiac disease. It is an inflammatory bowel disease also. There's definitely a genetic component to it. So if someone in your family has it, then you're much more likely to get it. And in this one, though, in Crohn's disease, your own GI tract has a difficulty clearing the bacteria. So here you get bacteria, oops, bacteria, there you go, build up in the GI tract, so the gastrointestinal tract. So in other words, your body has difficulty defeating the bacteria, especially in the large intestine, is Crohn's disease. Okay, also known as inflammatory bowel disease or a type of inflammatory bowel disease. So, so let me describe what's happening here. In your large intestine, so let's say this is your large intestine here, right? Within your large intestine, there are tons and tons of bacteria. So I'm just going to put a little bacteria in here. At least, so your large intestine is just filled, has a lot of bacteria in it, right? And most of you have heard of things like E. coli, right? Normally what happens is a part of your immune system, you basically have areas where there's a whole bunch of white blood cells that sit down here in the immune system. And so these white blood cells are housed in these little areas here. And the white blood cells are essentially here to keep in check and to kill any of the bacteria who try to get out of your large intestine. So large intestine, some of the bacteria try to get out, and what happens is these white blood cells say, nope, you can't leave here, and they kill it, right? In Crohn's disease, for whatever reason, these white blood cells are not doing their job. And so instead, what they're doing is they're either non-existent or they're not functioning, right? And so because there's such a reduction, it allows, it allows these bacteria to be able to super multiply, maybe escape into the system. So you just get this over ramping of bacteria within the GI tract. And so of course this causes all sorts of havoc within the GI tract. So all right, there you go. So that is, I was hoping to have more space here to do my next couple things, but those are the autoimmune diseases of the immune system. So again, autoimmune diseases where basically for whatever reason your own cells are attacking your own cells. So your immune system is attacking itself essentially. Okay, so continuing on here, so we're still on immune system pathologies. So let me title that here. So we did our biggest category, which is autoimmune diseases, where your immune system attacks itself. The second type is a much easier category, and that is an overactive response. There's really only one type of overactive response that you need to know, and those are allergies. So allergies are, of course, we almost all know this, are typically responses to like pollen that get into your nasal cavity. And then you have this massive response to something that is, even though it isn't a foreign cell, it's not a bad foreign cell that you need to go after so hard. And that would be considered an overactive response. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that here right now. The third major immunosystem pathology is the opposite, really, which is a lack of response. Now, the lack of response, there's a title for these. Lack of response is called an immunodeficiency. So we would call this an immunodeficiency disease. Now, there are two primary types of lack of response. The first one being what's called a primary immunodeficiency. Now, in a primary immunodeficiency, the immune system is missing parts of its system. Or it is functioning improperly. Now, these are very difficult diseases. These are often called PIDs, so primary immunodeficiency diseases. There are over 250 rare and chronic diseases that fall into this category. Now, because primary immunodeficiency diseases are so rare and there's so many of them, I can't talk a ton about them just because they're kind of oblique. But basically, I would not want to have this type of immunodeficiency because if you look at it, there's so few people that have these that more than likely the medical corporations, that work on treating these diseases are not going to probably look at your disease because there just isn't enough money in creating a cure for it. So that's one of the unfortunate things about this. But here, for instance, you could be born, like, let's say, without beta cells or something like that, so a certain type of cells within your immune system. Excuse me, did I say beta cells? Yeah, I did. I meant like dendritic cells or something like that. So you could be born without a specific type of cell, and that then can basically compromise your immune system. So not the best thing to have, especially because they're very difficult to treat. Okay, the other type of, I think I'm going to go to a different color here, of immunodeficiency disease is called an acquired immunodeficiency. In an acquired immunodeficiency, which most of you are probably aware of acquired immunodeficiencies just because there's at least one running around that most of you know about. What happens here is if you acquire an immunodeficiency, it's caused by a couple of different things can cause this. Either the environment, so maybe you've digested some sort of toxin that has wiped out part of your immune system. So it can be caused by the environment or by a disease that basically takes out part of your immune system functionality. Okay. Typical ways that this occurs are through, we'll start with the most basic, which is malnutrition. So malnutrition can lead to an acquired immunodeficiency because if you are not ingesting the right nutrients, then what can happen is your immune system, which needs certain type of nutrients, it can basically lose part of its functionality because it's not getting the nutritional requirements that it needs. We don't see this very often in first world countries, but you could see it if you go to like a third world country. Second way that this happens is through cancer. So if you accidentally have a growth in an area that is supposed to produce certain type of white blood cells or something like that, it can basically wipe out that production by just overwhelming it. So, like a bone marrow cancer or something like that would probably be quite devastating. So, third way, which is the way that most people know about, is through infections. And so this is, the same as disease up here, right? The most famous infection is AIDS, and AIDS stands for acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And AIDS is actually caused by a virus called HIV. Now, this is not the only infection that can cause this, actually. One of the reasons why HIV is so interesting is because of the way that it actually attacks the immune system. But it's not the only one that can actually wipe out the immune system. Other common diseases that can do this include some that you might not expect. Chickenpox. So back before we had a vaccine for chickenpox, people would intentionally try to infect each other with chickenpox so that they could build up internally the antibody to it. But sometimes the chickenpox can have some pretty bad side effects. It can actually take out part of your immune system sometimes. Measles is another one. So you can see that a number of these diseases we've developed vaccines for. So it takes away this probability of developing an acquired immunodeficiency from getting the disease, which is fantastic. Tuberculosis used to be able to do this. Well, still can if you catch it. One of the things that made SARS so deadly when it was going around, and it's still out there somewhere, but is that it can also do this. But also just general bacterial and fungal infections can do this as well. So there's a whole bunch of things that can actually wipe out your immune system, or parts of your immune system. Like I say, the most predominant one here is AIDS. All right, so next I want to talk about the immune response. And so how the immune system responds to foreign invaders. So there are two broad categories for this response. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of each. The first one is called the innate immune system. So innate immunity. Innate immunity consists of several parts. Just to be very clear, this is not just the ability that you're born with. A lot of people think that the only response you're born with is innate, but in fact you're born with all your responses, okay? So not the only one you're born with. Innate immunity includes things like physical barriers, and so those include skin is the biggest one, your mucous membranes, and also anything in your digestive system, so like stomach acids, things like that. All right. In addition to that, there are some things about the innate immune system that can recognize foreign invaders, but they're very broad. So it basically has a broad recognition of invaders. And when I say a broad recognition, part of what I'm talking about is it will recognize what are called PAMPs. And PAMPs refers to pathogen associated molecular patterns. So again, a PAMP is a pathogen associated molecular pattern. these patterns are, you can think of them almost like antigens, but do not write down antigens here. Okay, but think of them as a form of antigen. It's basically something that the innate immune system can recognize and go after, but they are not antigens. The reason why I say that is because antigens require that you have an antibody, and PAMPs do not have antibodies associated with them. Okay, so pathogen-associated molecular pattern. And another way to think of this is that all bacteria have similar patterns of proteins on and sugars on the outside of them. And your innate immune system can pick up on that and actually try to kill anything that shows that, bacterial type of molecular pattern. Not all of the patterns are the same. There's a bunch of different ones, so it's much more complicated than how I'm making it sound, but there it is. Okay, the thing about the innate immune system is that it is very fast acting. In other words, all of these things are readily available. For instance, skin is there to block anything incoming. Mucus not only blocks, but it also has chemicals and some cells in it that help to try to kill bacteria and viruses. And stomach acid is always there as well. There are, though, parts of the innate immune system that do have more of a reaction to them. And typically what's going to happen in the innate immune system when it's activated is you're going to see things like inflammation. You'll get areas that are, red. They typically feel warm to the touch when the innate immune system is activated, and oftentimes it causes swelling. And so you get this release of what are called cytokines by the innate immune system that then go on to cause these reactions. So the innate immune system, like I say, it's always there. It's always up and running. It basically kind of kills things in a generalized way, is the way that I want you to think about it. Okay. The second type of immune response that we have, and I'll go into just a little bit more about innate immune system in just a little bit. So the second type that we have is called acquired. So acquired immunity, and there's a couple other names for this, so I want to give you those as well. You may hear of this called as called the adaptive immunity. And there's actually a subpart of this also called humoral immunity. All of those, they basically mean about the same thing. So I almost always call it the acquired immune system. So you'll hear me say that a lot. This type of immune response is much more specific. So this is where a lot of the specificity comes in. And so you have to kind of build the specific response. But one of the flaws in the system is that it is slow on its first response to a pathogen. And we'll get into why later on. Then what it has to do is it sets up memory. And once there's a memory of that infection, then further responses are fast. Okay, so secondary responses. Okay, so secondary responses are faster. So, and that's the difference between that and the innate immune system. In the innate immune system, you always have a quick response, but it is not very specific, and it does not. No, there's some memory in the innate immune system, but not nearly as much as in the acquired. So the acquired is more specific, slow at first, better at response the next time it sees that pathogen. There are really two subtypes of acquired immunity down here. And so those subtypes of acquired immunity are called cell-mediated And in a cell-mediated acquired immune response, there's no antibodies involved. So these would include things like phagocytosis and like cytokine release. Then the second subtype down here is called humoral. And so like I mentioned up here, you'll hear that term tossed around. And in a humoral response, this does involve antibodies. Okay. All right. So that's a general overview of the immune system, or at least immune responses here. Now let's take a quick look at some of the cells involved, so some of the white blood cells, and then I'm going to come back and finish up on the innate immune system. So let's clear that out, and I want to bring up a slide here. So here's a slide of the white blood cells, and I want you to understand, first of all, that mast cells and basophils are the same thing. This type of cell, and when you're looking at a blood slide, is going to be quite rare. These are allergic response mediators, so they're involved in allergies. They have a tendency to, especially the mast cells, they have a tendency to become overactive. Some of the things they do include releasing histamine and heparin. Okay, so histamine and heparin are what these guys release. Histamine causes inflammation. And histamine causes inflammation, and heparin is an anticoagulant. And that anticoagulant allows blood to get to the areas that these guys are where they're trying to destroy bacteria or viruses, right? Okay. Now you might say, if they're only involved in allergic responses, why do we have them? Well, of course there are other things that they do, like releasing histamine and heparin. And so they're not just involved in allergic reactions, but I want you to be aware that they are, and you can see that down here. All right, next type of cell is called an eosinophil. This is also a very rare cell. You can see down here that it goes after primarily parasites. All right, so you should be aware of that. It is also involved in allergic reactions, even though they didn't list that down here. And one thing to note, I'm going to give you what these cells primarily do, but they all kind of cross over and help each other out. Okay, so eosinophils primarily go after parasites and are involved in allergic reactions as well, so they get overreactive around pollen. Neutrophils are the most common type of white blood cell. About 70% of all the white blood cells that you see, and you can see that number down here, are neutrophils. They mostly go after bacteria. And so even though they just have ingest and destroy invaders down here, the main thing they go after are bacteria, but they can go after a whole bunch of other things as well. They are phagocytic, meaning that they engulf bacteria and eat bacteria. They are very short-lived, actually. They don't live very long. That's probably because there are so many bacteria in the environment, in the body, that neutrophils, live a relatively short life. And they release cytokines, so they can do signaling as well. Basically, by releasing cytokines, they can call in other types of cells. Next type of white blood cell over here are monocytes and macrophages, so you should know these as basically being the same type of cell. Monocytes are really the precursors to macrophages. These are primarily phagocytic cells, so they have a tendency to eat things. You can see that there are subtypes of these macrophages down here, like Kupffer cells, osteoclasts, microglia. These are all types of monocytes/macrophages. They do this thing called antigen presentation, as you can see down here, which means that they can actually take an antigen from an invader and put it on their cell surface and present it to other cells. I'll go over this in more detail in a later talk, but it's kind of interesting. These cells can also be either fixed, so located in one place and never leave that tissue, or they can be wandering and actually go out and circulate in the blood. Next type of white blood cell over here are lymphocytes. Now there are several different types of lymphocytes. We can see down here the different subtypes, so you should be aware of these, and I'll go through these in more detail later. B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and natural killer cells are all different types of lymphocytes. These cells primarily go after virus-infected cells, but obviously all of these, again, they do cross over and attack other things like bacteria and stuff like that, but primarily they go after virus-infected cells. Natural killer cells are good at going after cancer cells, in fact. So tumor cells and cancer cells, these natural killer cells will try to attack those. That's a very difficult job because that is basically identifying one of your own cells as doing something wrong. And if it's one of your own cells, remember your body is trained to not kill itself, and so it's very difficult to identify a cell of your own that's doing the wrong thing. So that's a very hard job for them to do, but they do a pretty good job of it actually. So the plasma cells here are a subtype of lymphocyte under the B cells, and we'll talk more about those later. And then the last one here is dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are also antigen-presenting cells also. So just like the macrophages, they'll do this antigen presentation that you can see listed down here. So they will basically eat a bacteria, pull the antigens off of it, and then show it to other white blood cells to help them find that bacteria. These are the dendritic cells are primarily found in the skin, in the linings of the lungs, the nose, and the intestines. So basically any place that is facing out towards the external environment will typically have these dendritic cells. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and talk about a little more deeply, although not too much here. I want to go back to the whiteboard. We're going to talk lastly here about the innate immune system. So a few more things about the innate immune system. So these are final thoughts on innate immunity. So besides the overview notes that I gave you, there are a couple other things here. The innate immune system, besides being able to recognize PAMPs, involving the skin and mucous membranes, you can also have a release from these cells of what are called chemotaxins. So the cells of the innate immune system are able to release chemotaxins, and these chemotaxins are chemicals that draw in other white blood cells. Now, chemotaxins aren't necessarily just released by cells in the innate immune system. These chemotaxins can come from a number of different places. So what releases chemotaxins include cells that have been damaged, so damaged cells. So this is your own cells basically calling for help. Other white blood cells can release, so many white blood cells, so however you want to say that, other white blood cells can release chemotaxins, and bacteria themselves can actually release chemotaxins as well. So basically, even bacteria can sometimes accidentally, they don't mean to do this obviously, can release chemicals that actually attract white blood cells. All right, the other thing that the immune system can use are called opsonins. Now, opsonins is any molecule that enhances phagocytosis. Okay, so again, an opsonin is any molecule that can enhance phagocytosis. Typically this is done, or it can be done by, so typically I'm going to put here, by is done by marking an antigen. So usually antigens are marked by antibodies. However, the proteins of an antigen can also be marked by what are called complementary proteins. So what I'm going to put here is that, so subtypes of opsonins, so are antibodies. So antibodies are a type of opsonin. And another type that we'll talk about a little bit later, or on another talk, are called complementary proteins. Now, I want to make something very clear here, and that is that, so let me put a big star next to this, that antibodies are not part of the innate immune system, okay? Okay, the only reason that I listed antibodies here is because they are a type of opsonin. However, complementary proteins can be used within the innate immune system. So, all right, other types of cells within the innate immune system, or other reaction types within the innate immune system, include natural killer cells. So I'm going to list those as NK cells, often work under the innate immune system. And if you remember, natural killer cells go after cancer cells. So they try to kill cancer cells. And they often also go after virus-infected cells. These NK cells also wind up secreting antiviral chemicals. And you may hear of these, and sometimes we actually use these in modern medicine. They'll make them and use them, called interferons. Okay. In addition to that, some of the other features of the innate immune system include the use of cytokines, and cytokines, just so you're aware, are a broad range of small proteins that are used in cell signaling. Okay, so which kind of makes sense, right? If the innate immune system is probably going to be the first system to encounter a invader, and so it wants to be able to signal to the rest of the immune system to come in and help out. And then lastly, this innate immune system, like I've mentioned before, heavily uses inflammation as well. The adaptive immune system can also use inflammation, but primarily it's used by the innate. Okay, and with that, I only have one more slide to show you here, so let me do this and bring this up. I just wanted to show this attack complex here that's used by natural killer cells just because it's kind of interesting. This is how natural killer cells actually go after and defeat bacterial cells. What they do, so if you look here, if, for instance, this here is a bacteria that has invaded your system, what NK cells do, natural killer cells do, is they release these protein complexes called perforins, And these perforins will go and basically form holes in the surface of the bacteria. And of course, if you form a hole through the plasma membrane of any cell, what's going to happen is water is going to try to come to equilibrium. And in this case, because these cells have so many small particulates inside of them, the water chases the solutes inside of the cell, and the cell swells up and blows up. So it's kind of interesting that these NK cells sometimes don't even have to put a caustic chemical onto a bacteria. They just poke some holes in it, and then it swells up and dies. So this is what perforin is all about. Anyway, so that is the end of this particular lecture, and I will see you next time.